there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 4, and just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. We met a Frankenstein-like monster called the Patchwork Man, who was living in Anton's castle the whole time, but we didn't notice until issue 3. And the Patchwork Man accidentally explodes the castle with a bunch of chemicals that it mixes together. But luckily, Swamp Thing, who was also in the castle, is able to escape the explosion along with the Patchwork Man through a cavern that has a stream underneath the castle. In the meantime, Matt Cable also shows up in this Balkans region. He meets Abigail Arcane inside of the village below the castle, and he meets her exactly when the castle explodes, so them and the rest of the townspeople go to see what happened at Anton's castle, and we also learn that she is Anton's niece. And as her and Matt Cable are walking up to the castle, they are ambushed by the Patchwork Man, who recognizes her as his daughter because he is in fact Anton's brother, Gregory Arcane. But unfortunately, Gregory was experimented on after he was exploded by Anton, and that is why he looks like a Frankenstein monster. So, of course, the village people get all up in arms about it. Matt Cable leads them to where the Patchwork Man is, and of course, that is where Swamp Thing was as well. There's a big fight between the Patchwork Man and Swamp Thing over Abby, and eventually Abby is put in a very dangerous situation where she's hanging from a beam over a ravine, and the two monsters actually team up to save her. And when they do, the Patchwork Man falls to his death just as Abby realizes that in fact is her father, Gregory Arcane, who she thought was dead for most of her life. And we left with Abigail Arcane and Matt Cable leaving the Balkans on their red plane, going back to America, and Swamp Thing hitching a ride on the outside. And that is where we left off for issue 3. So first things first with issue 4. The setting is a dark, spooky night with a bright full moon. We see there is some sort of werewolf monster approaching Swamp Thing as he is rising from the water, I think, that is covered with a bunch of leaves. And it looks like they're about to fight. And we see on the first page that the name of this issue is Monster on the Moors, and it is written by Len Wein with art by Bernie Wrightson. And on this first page, we get a full page splash where we can see the wreckage of the red plane that Abigail and Matt were flying home in the last issue. And Swamp Thing is rising from some water with a bunch of broken branches and leaves on top of him. And there's narration that says, "The night is made of fog, a musty gray blanket that lies upon the landscape like a shroud, oppressing all it embraces. Treetops, hillocks, everything covered by the same pervading mist. But this night, two new objects thrust from the cold fen floor. One, the ruptured wreckage of what once had been a sleek 4-engine seaplane. The other, the twisted ruin of what once had been a man. Slowly, the Swamp Thing staggers to his feet and surveys the mangled aircraft. And as Swamp Thing looks at the plane, he thinks, haven't been out long. Better check the plane. Cable and the others might still be alive in there." And just as he's about to check the plane, he hears a noise behind him and he thinks, huh? Something coming. Better get out of sight till I learn what's going on. So he hides, and we see that there's a horse and carriage coming up, and there are two people in it, a man and a woman, and the woman is saying, "Angus, look, we're too late. He's already here." And she says that because she sees the vague form of Swamp Thing through the fog, but the husband doesn't see it, and he says, "Nay, Jenna, 'tis only a figment of the fog. He couldn't have beat us here." And Jenna replies, "But what if he has? After all our work, to lose another one?" But Angus cuts her off saying, "Stop whimpering, woman, and help examine the plane. There might be something worth salvaging." So the two people go to the plane and begin searching around, and Swamp Thing is watching from a distance, and the narration says, "As the Swamp Thing watches, the strange couple disappears into the wreck, to emerge moments later carrying a limp burden, then another, until finally..." And we see the couple is carrying Matt Cable out of the plane, and Angus is saying, "Be careful, Jenna. This is the last of them, and praise heaven they're all alive." And Jenna says, "Aye, and 'tis no wonder this one is, being such a fine broth of a lad, not at all like..." But she is cut off before she can finish her sentence by Angus saying, "Enough, Jenna. I'll have no more of your weeping for what cannot be changed." But she replies, "But we can change it, Angus. I know we can." Then she pauses as she looks down at the three people in the back of their carriage, and she asks, "Where do you suppose they were going?" And Angus replies, "Who can say? It makes no difference now." So as they ride away, we see Swamp Thing is watching them still from a distance, and he's thinking, "From the sound of their voices, I guess we crashed somewhere on the Scottish moors. but from the tone of their voices, I don't think Cable and company have fallen into safe hands. Scotland or not, I've never seen an ambulance to resemble that one. I doubt if my friends are being taken to a hospital, but wherever they're going, I'm going with them. So Swamp Thing is definitely right here. If you didn't pick up on it, the couple kept mentioning someone else who seems to have some kind of affliction that they can't change, and I guess these passengers from the plane might be helpful to them. So Swamp Thing follows them all the way back to a very spooky house, and we get some narration that says, "Time passes. A rutted, mist-swept road echoes to the squeal of rusted springs as the antique carriage rolls on. Above, an angry amber moon claws away its cloudy covering to rule a star-streaked sky. And at last, at very long last, a moss-encrusted mockery finds himself standing before a building, the only structure to defy the fog for countless miles round. The Swamp Thing studies the aging manor, its musty, grim facade, and he knows that the wagon has come home." Then we cut to the inside of the house, and we see everybody from the plane is awake, and Angus and Jenna are attending to them. And the narration says, "Spin the hands of the clock, and it's later that same night, as the revived Matt Cable, his companion Abigail Arcane, and their pilot Paul Rodman share tea with their newfound hosts." And we see the 3 crash survivors are bundled up in a blanket next to a fireplace, inside of a big grand dining room where there's a large table in front of them as well. And Matt Cable says to Angus, "Guess we owe you our lives, Squire Macabre, if you hadn't pulled us from the plane." But he's cut off by Angus, who says, "Call me Angus, Mr. Cable. Ain't ye owe us nothing. 'Twas only the decent thing to do. We couldn't have ye lying there. But tell me, man, how came ye to be there in the first place?" So Matt Cable answers him, and he begins to recount what happened with the plane and how it crashed. So we get some flashback panels where we see the plane is flying and it's during a thunderstorm. And Matt Cable says, "To tell you the truth, Angus, I'm still not entirely certain. I know the beginning well enough, but the ending is pretty blurred. We were flying through a storm that I much remember. A bad storm, getting worse. And Paul was doing his best bucking that wind when..." And we cut to inside the plane and we see Matt Cable and Abby are bouncing around inside the cabin. And Abby is asking, "Matt, what's happening? It feels like we're falling." And Matt answers her, "Something wrong with the engines, Abigail. Strap yourself in. I'm going forward to talk to Paul." Then we cut to the cockpit where Matt Cable is talking to the pilot, Paul Rodman, and Matt's narration continues. "2 of our engines were out. Not a chance of making it to an airport. We descended, looking for a flat stretch to use for an emergency landing, when suddenly we spotted..." And in the panel, we see from the cockpit, Matt Cable and Paul are looking at a long strip of what looks like landing lights. And Paul cries out, "Runway lights! There must be a private airstrip down there. This baby's not exactly built for touching down on land, but..." And then Matt finishes his sentence by saying, "Beggars can't be choosers," to coin a phrase. "Just set her down easy, Paul, and pray." Then the flashback sequence ends and we're back inside of the dining room with Angus and Jenna. And Matt is finishing his story saying, "We went down for the landing, and the next thing I remember is waking up here." And then Abigail tells them, "We could have been killed." And Angus replies to her, "Aye, and 'tis a miracle you weren't." Then we cut to the outside of that room where Swamp Thing is watching this scene of them talking through a window. And he thinks, "No, Squire, it wasn't a miracle. It was muscle. I am the reason your guests are still among the living." Then we get Swamp Thing's flashback of what actually happened when the landing took place. And we get a panel that shows Swamp Thing manhandling the plane and pushing against it as it crashes down into the ground, almost like he's slowing it down so it didn't break apart. And his thoughts over this flashback say, "I saw what the others did not, that there was no runway, only the string of lights. You see, I was a passenger on the plane too, outside the plane, riding on one of the platoons. And when that great bird came screaming in for a non-existent landing, it was I who cushioned the crash, using my own deformed body as a brake." Then the flashback ends and Swamp Thing thinks outside the window, "It would be so simple for me to walk in there and explain it to you. Just burst in and shout that I'm Dr. Alec Holland. But Alec Holland is dead in Matt Cable's eyes, and he must remain that way. For Alec Holland alone knows the secret biorestorative formula, the chemical that made me what I've become, and nobody else must ever be tempted to discover it again." So instead of going inside the house and telling everybody who he is and that he's alive, he decides to not do that so that the biorestorative formula will remain a secret. So he kind of walks away all sad because of this. And then we cut back to the house again where we see Paul Rodman is talking to Angus. And Paul says, well, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go check the damage on my plane. I still have a report to make out. But Angus tells him, I wouldn't do that if I were ye, Mr. Rodman. The moors are a dangerous place at night, prowled by wild animals, wolves, dogs, heaven knows what else. Aye, man, ye be'd well advised to stay indoors tonight. But Paul doesn't listen to him, and he proceeds to leave the house, and as he walks outside, he says to Angus, Advice noted, Squire. My plane takes priority. There may still be a chance that the radio's working. I'll be back shortly. And Angus shouts back to him, Pay heed, man, or ye may not be back at all. So we cut to a couple minutes later while Paul is walking in the foggy darkness, and we do see far in the fog behind him, there was a shape following him in the darkness. And the narration says, The night is made of fog and shaped by shadows. Kaleidoscope patterns spill at random across the marsh, creating life where none exist, and sometimes hiding life that does. And Paul senses something is wrong because he thinks to himself, Feel a chill down my spine. Either I'm not dressed well enough for this cold, damp weather, or something is following me. And just as he thinks that, he turns around and he sees a dark figure approaching. And it's definitely not Swamp Thing because this thing has fur all over its body, and it has large pointy ears, and its eyes are glowing red. And you probably guessed it already because of the cover, but this is obviously a werewolf coming up behind him. So as Paul turns and sees this creature coming up behind him, he thinks, My God, I'm right! Something is following me! Something inhuman! Then we get a cool panel of Paul looking terrified as the shadow from the werewolf's claws cover his face. Then we cut back to the house where the others' conversation is being interrupted by the screams from Paul Rodman, and the narration says, Somehow the fear-filled scream that drifts in from the bog is not totally unexpected by those in the ancient manor, but all heads turn at the sound just the same. Some are alarmed and some are frightened, and some only curious. And we see the alarmed people are Matt Cable and Abby, the frightened people are Angus and Jenna, and the curious one is Swamp Thing, who we cut to somewhere else on the moors, and he's thinking, That shriek, not the howl of the wind, ought to find out what it was. Then we cut to a panel of Angus, Gemma, Matt Cable, and Abby, and they are out in the moors and they have found the body of Paul Rodman. And he is completely torn up by that werewolf. And Abby sees him and says, How horrible! His throat! And Matt Cable interjects, Like it was torn out by some wild dog. And Angus goes over to the body and brings the lantern in closer to get a better look, and he kind of says to Matt Cable, Aye, 'tis wild, all right, but 'tis not a dog. And Matt Cable asks, And what is that supposed to mean? And Angus answers, What it says, man. The creature that stalks this fen by night is not a natural beast. It struck before it has, killed some sheep, horses, and tonight it's killed a man. Then we cut to a little distance away where we see Swamp Thing is watching this scene from afar, and he's thinking, It seems I'm not the only monster walking the moors this evening. Think I'll stick around a while to meet the other one. So Angus and company wrap up the body of Paul Rodman and take it back to the house. And we see inside the foyer, Angus is saying to Matt, I'm sorry about your friend, Mr. Cable, but you shouldn't have ignored my warning. Scotland is an ancient country with a heritage of legends and mysteries, and more than its share of monsters. And it seems that Matt Cable is definitely not buying what Angus is selling, because he angrily yells back at Angus, That's a crock of claptrap, Squire. If you expect me to believe the Loch Ness Monster is going to come scratching at your door, you're wasting your... But then Matt Cable is cut off by the sound of scratching at the door. And this actually spooks Matt a bit because he says, What in the name of... And as he goes to open the door, Abby says, Matt, be careful. You have no idea what's out there. And as Matt grips the handles, he says, Maybe not, but if it's the Loch Ness Monster, I want to see it for myself. Now keep back, everybody. And then he pulls out his gun from his pocket and continues, I may have to come out shooting. And as Matt opens the door, the narration says, There is the faintest hint of a tremble in Matt Cable's hand as he throws open the old oaken door to reveal. And as he opens the door, we see that the dog is actually standing there, and that was what was scratching earlier. And I was worried for a bit because we hadn't heard about this dog for a while. They made it seem like maybe he didn't make it through the plane crash, but luckily he did. And if you don't remember, this is the dog that Alec Holland found, but was actually used by the evil Conclave as a way to keep tabs on Matt Cable and his wife Linda's progress with the biorestorative formula, because the dog has a radio transmitter on it that allows Mr. E, the evil leader of the Conclave, to listen in and hear what is being said. So everybody calms down once they see it's just the dog, and Abby says, "Matt, it's your dog. He followed us all the way from the plane." And Matt Cable says, "The poor mutt. In all the confusion, I forgot about him. Come here, boy. Come on in. Wouldn't want you to spend the night alone." And of course, the dog goes in the house, and apparently they have a nice night because we cut to the morning, and we see Matt Cable and Abby are getting ready to leave, and they have some luggage in their hand, and the narration is saying, "The sun rises early the next morning, and the two traveling companions rise with it. A brief journey is made to retrieve some luggage from the shattered aircraft. Then," and we see that Jenna is in the room with them, and she's saying, "What? You cannot be leaving already? Why, you hardly got here." And Matt replies, "I'm afraid we must leave, Lady Macabre. As soon as your husband has the horses harnessed, we'll be on our..." But he's cut off by someone saying, "Mother, why did you not tell me we had company?" Then we see a young gentleman approach Matt Cable, and he's got his hand outstretched to shake Matt Cable's hand, and he introduces himself saying, "I hope I didn't startle ye, but it's not often we have guests here. I'm Ian Macabre, and 'tis a pleasure to meet you, mister." And Matt answers, "Matt Cable, Ian, and the pleasure is mutual." Then we get a close-up panel of the two men's hands as they are about to shake. And specifically on Ian's hand, you definitely notice a lot more hair than normal. I mean, he's even got it on the inside of his palms, which I was told meant something else, but apparently that is from something else. And the narration over this panel says, "Witness, two hands extend to seal a bond that transcends all theologies and nationalities, the bond of friendship." And after they shake hands, Ian actually bends down and grabs their bags and says, "Here, let me carry your bags out to the carriage for you." But then Angus calls out of nowhere and says, "Don't bother. Our guests aren't going nowhere." And everybody turns to look at him and he says, "Sorry if I startled ye, but I had bad news. In all the excitement last night, I'm afraid I did not stable the horses properly, and now she seems to have run off. We're isolated out here, no use for automobiles and such. So Becky was the only transportation around for miles. It'll take a day or so to have something sent up for you, so you're welcome to spend another night." And with no other options, of course they do. So we cut to some hours later in the evening when the sun is setting, and the narration says, "Sunset. The ribbon-like curtain of clouds grows wilder, darker, as the struggling sun is torn apart and pulled into the sea. And within the solitary manor, the conquest of darkness goes all but unnoticed, by all save one." And we cut to inside the house as the dog begins to growl and freak out uncontrollably. And Matt sees this and says, "Hey, what's wrong with the dog? He's growling like someone was stealing his last bone." And Abby says, "Matt, something's frightening him." And Matt replies, "I know it, Abigail, and I think I'll find out what." So Matt takes his gun out of his pocket and he slowly walks up to the door and begins to open it. And as we turn the page, we just cut to him and Abby outside. So I guess they've left the house to see what the dog was growling at. And we see that Abigail is actually running up to him saying, "Matt, wait, I'm coming with you." And Matt says to her, "No, Abigail, stay inside. And then Matt Cable pauses because he remembers something. And he says, "On second thought, maybe you'd better stay with me. The last time I made the mistake of leaving someone alone, I had to bury her next to her husband. And I swore I'd never have to live through that again. Stay close, Abby, and we'll..." And just as he was about to finish that thought, Abby yells out, "Matt!" And as Matt Cable turns to look behind him, he sees a giant werewolf standing, and he says, "What in the..." And the narration says, Interpol agent Matt Cable whirling at the sound of the low, throaty growl to find himself confronting his mind's darkest nightmare. And as the creature lopes forward, and we see Matt Cable instinctively shoots his gun at the werewolf, and he hits it, but it doesn't seem to do anything. And Matt Cable says, "The slug went right through him harmlessly." And then Matt Cable has a realization about the situation they're in, and he yells out in fear, "He's between us and the house, Abby. Run for the moors. Maybe we can lose him in the fog." So they take off into the fog, and as they disappear, the werewolf looks on after them, and the narration says, "The fur-tufted creature watches as the two fleeing figures fade into the mist, and what is almost a smile crosses its slavering lips. It has played this game before, enjoying the thrill of the hunt, herding its victims breathlessly before it, until they had no place to run." So because Matt Cable and Abby don't know this area very well, they actually ran into a dead end. So they can't get out of this rocky area, and the werewolf has them cornered, and the narration continues. The creature squats on its haunches, muscles bunching, studying its desperate prey for the point of greatest weakness, too involved in the moment to notice that the hunter has suddenly become the hunted. And right as the narration says this, we see a green arm come out of nowhere and grab the werewolf by the back. And it's actually much smaller than Swamp Thing, so he can just pick it up. And so he's holding it in the air, and he's thinking, don't know what this creature is, but it already has killed once. Can't give it a second chance. And Matt Cable sees what's going on, and he says to Abby, quick, let's get out of here. So they leave the area while Swamp Thing is distracting the werewolf. And while they're fighting, I guess it's so foggy that Swamp Thing can't really see what he's fighting. And the narration says, the Swamp Thing peers at his opponent anxiously, trying to identify it through the pervading mist. And then Swamp Thing thinks, fog too thick. I can't see what I'm fighting. And I guess because he's just holding the werewolf still in front of him, the werewolf takes advantage of him pausing, and it begins to wrestle with Swamp Thing until it's finally on top of Swamp Thing's back. And the narration says, a blur of motion, and the creature is upon the Swamp Thing's back, clawing, tearing, spitting out great clots of foul-tasting sap. And this is the first time Swamp Thing's ever come up against a monster like this, so he's thinking, it's ripping me to pieces. Got to get him off. And somehow he's able to reach behind and grab the werewolf by the legs, and then swinging the werewolf by his feet, he throws the werewolf through the air, and this move actually throws Swamp Thing off balance, so he begins to slip and fall, and apparently he falls backward into something that looks like mud, but is actually quicksand. And as the werewolf recovers, he looks over and he sees Swamp Thing sinking down, and the narration says, the beast creature watches with interest as the muck-encrusted monstrosity sinks lower and lower into the ooze. And Swamp Thing is thinking as he's sinking down, my weight pulling me down. But Swamp Thing is powerless to do anything, and the werewolf just watches as Swamp Thing's head goes below the surface. Then we cut back to Angus and Gemma's house, and the narration says, the night is made of fog and shaped by shadows, and lit by the glow of a full moon. The heavenly orb stands emotionlessly as two panting figures reach the safety of an old dark house. There, amid the trappings of security, the tale can be told, and questions can be asked. And we see in the dining room of the house, Matt Cable and Abby are recounting to Angus and Jenna what happened. And Matt Cable says, I'm still not certain what saved us. I couldn't see anything clearly through that blasted mist. But if I didn't know any better, I'd swear, nah, it couldn't be. We left him back in the Balkans. So Angus walks over to Matt Cable and he hands him a glass of sherry and says, here, Mr. Cable, a wee bit of sherry. 'Twill help you relax. And Matt Cable takes the glass saying, thanks, we could use it. But as he takes the glass, we see that Angus and Jenna kind of look at each other evilly, we'll say, like they're plotting something. And they watch very intently as Abby and Matt both drink the glasses of sherry. And as they drink, Jenna says, I hope you like it, sir. We made it ourselves from a very special recipe. And as she says the word special, Matt Cable falls to the ground out of his chair and Abby falls forward onto the table. It seems Jenna and Angus have drugged Matt Cable and Abby. And as we turn the page, we see a laboratory of some sort. There's two tables in a room, and on top of those tables are strapped Matt Cable on one and Ian McCobb on the other. And in between the tables, we see two vials of blood hanging with tubes that are connected to Matt and Ian respectively. And standing over the two tied down men are Angus and Jenna, and the narration says, for a time out of time, Matt Cable knows nothing. Then there comes the sensation of movement, of straps being fastened, tape being pressed against his still lips, and at last. And Matt Cable opens his eyes, and Angus sees him and says, welcome back, Mr. Cable. You've been sleeping for almost a day. Please, don't struggle. I assure ye, your bonds are quite tight. And then Ian begins to wake up, and he heard the word struggle, and he says, struggle? Where am I? What's happening? Why am I strapped down? And his mother goes over to him and says, easy now, laddie. You've been sleeping, but it's going to be all right now. We're going to operate, son. Cure ye of your damned disease once and for all. A total blood transfusion, son. Putting your tainted blood into Mr. Cable's body and his pure blood into yours. And Ian is kind of horrified by this, and he says, Mother, no! You cannot do it! It's horrible, insane! Even if he survives, do you realize what'll happen to him? And his mom replies, I do not care about him, son. I care about you. Why else do you think we strung those lanterns in the storm? To give the appearance of a runway below. And at these words, we're getting flashbacks that are showing what she's saying. So we're seeing her putting lanterns on sticks in a row so it looks like a runway. Then we're seeing a crashed plane on fire in the middle of those rows of lanterns, and she continues. Do you know how many planes believed those glowing lights and paid the price of their belief on the cold and foggy fen? We'd have performed the transfusion long ago, son, but nothing ever survived those dreadful wrecks, until now. We buried the poor unfortunates and the pieces of their planes deep in the bog and kept waiting, and now our waiting's done. And upon hearing the true extent of the horror that his parents have been up to, the son yells out, No, you can't! And he begins to struggle against his restraints, and they snap, and he's able to sit up, and Jenna's kind of shocked by her son's reaction, and she says, Son, you don't understand! And then he looks at her with a very horrified face and says, No, it's you who did not understand. How could you? You've never felt the moonlight burning deep in your flesh. And as he says this last line, all of a sudden his face begins to get hairier and his ears begin to get pointy, and it seems his werewolf transformation is taking place. And he continues, You've never felt your body change, muscles twisting, pulling, never felt the bloodlust raging inside you like a fire out of control. Please, I can't do it. You can't infect another innocent with a curse that turns me into this. And we get a pretty awesome splash page of a full werewolf body standing in front of his mother in the laboratory. And Jenna looks on in fear and yells out, Ian, no! And in the background, we do see Matt Cable is still tied down to the table, and he's looking at this in fear. He can't believe what he's seen. And you might be wondering, where is Abby in all this? And it turns out she is actually in the room. They just didn't show her before, but she's tied to a chair off to the side. And there's a rag tied around her mouth, so she can't say anything, but she's looking in fear. And the narration says, Abigail's eyes grow wide with fear as she watches the last vestiges of humanity drain from the face of the shaggy horror that confronts her, to be replaced by the gleam of pure animal lust and hunger. So even though his parents are in front of him, the werewolf Ian turns and sees Abby and runs straight for her. And the narration says, a hunger that will not be denied. And Ian's parents yell out, Ian, no, not here, not now. Stop him, Angus. For pity's sake, stop him! And in this panel, we do see in between the werewolf as it's running towards Abby, there is a door on the floor, which is kind of weird, but it must be like a basement door. And just as the werewolf is about to reach Abby, all of a sudden, that door opens up and we see Swamp Thing coming from below. And when Swamp Thing sees what's going on, he bursts through the door and it shatters into a million pieces, and he thinks, I spent almost a day clawing free of the quicksand, then following the beast's tracks here. But have I arrived too late? And the werewolf turns its head and sees what made the door burst, and it growls, Row! And the werewolf's not the only one surprised, because Matt Cable sees Swamp Thing and he says, What in the Swamp Thing? And as the werewolf pounces towards Swamp Thing thinks, Cable and the girl, still alive. Got to finish this creature before it finishes them. But how? How do you kill a werewolf? So because Swamp Thing wasn't quite off the stairs that he was coming up before, when the werewolf pounces on him, they both end up falling back down the stairs. And you know what? Now that I'm seeing this, it's not a basement. It's actually supposed to be in the attic, because when they go down the stairs, Swamp Thing and the werewolf are tumbling, and they roll back into the dining room area. And as they tumble, Swamp Thing's thinking, Ugh, force of his lunge, carrying us both downstairs. He's strong, incredibly strong. And if the werewolf legends are true, he's also immortal. Only one thing can destroy a werewolf, silver, but there's none within my reach. His parents have gotten rid of it all. So once they land in the dining room, the werewolf jumps immediately on Swamp Thing's back and begins to bite him in the back of the neck. And Swamp Thing thinks, have to get him off before he tears me to pieces, but the beast has a grip like steel. So the werewolf actually climbs onto Swamp Thing's front at this point and begins choking Swamp Thing. And because he's on top of Swamp Thing now and he's pushing Swamp Thing back, choking him, Swamp Thing looks up and he sees above the dining table, there is a chandelier that looks like it is made of silver. And he thinks, his parents removed all the silver from the cupboards and walls, every place but from the ceiling. So Swamp Thing is able to make some space between him and the werewolf, and he jumps as high as he can, and he grabs at the chandelier. And so far, we haven't really seen the chandelier, but on the bottom of it, there is a very large silver spike. So as Swamp Thing grabs the side of it, the chain that's holding it to the ceiling actually breaks, and he falls down to the table, of course smashing it. And then he begins to swing the chandelier in circles around him, so it's kind of whirling around him with him in the middle, and he thinks, This should hold him back until I can think of something more effective. And Gemma and Angus have followed the two down the stairs and into the dining room. And as she sees Swamp Thing swinging the silver chandelier at her son, she yells out, "Please, no! Do not hurt my boy!" And just as she reaches her son, the narration says, the anxious Jenna Macabre reaches her transformed son as the already weakened chandelier chain decides to snap. And Jenna is actually in between the chandelier and the werewolf when the chain breaks and the chandelier is heading straight for her. So it looks like she's going to be killed and impaled by this silver spike on the bottom of the chandelier. But just as that's about to happen, all of a sudden she's pushed aside and the narration says, there is only time for one motion, but it is the werewolf or the man within who pushes the old woman out of harm's way. So the werewolf's son has saved his mother, and the chandelier point definitely impales him. And because the chandelier is so big and heavy, it actually pushes the werewolf out of the window as well from its momentum. So the werewolf crashes through the window and outside, and it's sitting there with the spike in its chest, and Jenna and Angus run out to find their son. And they see him impaled on the ground underneath the chandelier, and Jenna says, Ian, son, why'd you do it? Why'd you destroy yourself to save me? And the werewolf growls, Mother. And as Jenna walks closer, she says, Oh, Ian, I'm an old lady. My time is almost done. But you had... But she's cut off by the werewolf saying, I had nothing but an eternal hell, living in fear of the moon, always dreading the moment the beast that I am would turn on someone I love. And then I guess because he's about to die, he fully transforms back into a human. And he says to his mother, No, Mother, believe me, it's better this way. Much better. And with that, Ian dies, and Jenna cradles his body crying, saying, Sleep well, my son, sleep well. And while this is happening, we also saw Matt Cable and Abby come through the window with the dog. So they walk up to the scene, and Matt Cable says, Nothing more to be done here. The beast is dead, and the Swamp Thing is probably long gone. The sooner we get moving, the sooner I can get back on its trail. And Abigail says, Matt, you're not serious. Twice now that creature has saved our lives, and you still want to hunt it down? Don't you know the meaning of gratitude? And as Cable looks out onto the mist of the fen, he says, Gratitude is only for the innocent, Abigail. Something that monster is not. He killed my friends Alec and Linda Holland, and somehow, I'm gonna make him pay. And in the last panel, we see Swamp Thing walking away in the mist, far from the house, as Matt Cable says this. And that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comic-books, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.